In 1896, I traveled across the southern Sahara desert with a small group. We followed a path that wasn't shown on any map. We rode camels from a faraway army post, carrying water, tools, and one goal: to find out if a lost town was real. For many days, the desert looked normal. Then our guide started avoiding the ground in front of us. A line of cut stones appeared in the sand. The camels didn't want to rest, and the ground began to shake under our feet. When the ruins finally appeared, it became clear they were not empty. Before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I left Taman Rasset in the first week of November 1896, with a map case tied to my saddle and a travel letter folded inside my coat. The army clerk who stamped it didn't look at me twice. He looked at the boxes instead. 2 boxes of tools, 1 box of dry food, 1 of lamp oil, and a narrow metal chest with a lock that belonged to the man who paid for the trip. His name was Morel. He called himself a supporter of learning and business. He wore a clean jacket even in the dust and kept his hands soft. He didn't ride well, but he forced himself to sit up straight because he wanted us to see that he wasn't weak. He spoke French to me and to the doctor, and he spoke to the guides. Through our translator, never straight to them. I was there to write down the path and to draw what we found. I had been hired because I could measure distances, find directions, and copy ancient writing without guessing. I had done work along the coast and in the mountains, but the desert was different. The first day outside the town, I already understood I had brought the wrong habits with me. A mistake in the mountains costs hours. A mistake out there costs water. The doctor was named Delmas. He was older than the rest of us and had a calm way of watching people. He carried a small leather bag of tools and medicines and treated even small cuts as if they were important. He didn't speak much during the march, but when we stopped, he asked questions about what we ate and how we slept. He watched our tongues. When we opened our mouths, he looked at urine in the sand with the same care he gave to a fever. The third European was a man called Renaud. Morel said he had served in an army group to the south and knew how to keep order. Renaud wore a sun scarf like the locals, but he kept his rifle as if it were part of his body. He wasn't loud, he wasn't mean, he was tense. And he treated every delay as if it were an insult. I learned early not to argue with him when the wind was up because he took any raised voice as the start of a fight. Our translator was a young man named Karim from the north. He spoke Arabic, Tamashek, and enough French to work, and he knew how to soften a question without changing its meaning. He wasn't a guide. He didn't pretend to be. He stayed close to whoever was speaking and watched faces more than words. Guide who led the camels was a Tuareg man named Alay. He didn't like to give his name at first, but Morel insisted, and Karim asked properly, and Alay gave it as if he were handing over a coin he might not get back. He had a long veil and a short blade at his hip, and he carried himself like someone used to distance. He watched the horizon with a patient stare and could tell which patch of sand had been touched within a day. He didn't explain how he knew. He simply knew. There was also a camel handler named Oman, quiet and thin, with a cough that stayed in his chest. He sang under his breath while he worked, not for cheer, but to keep count of tasks. I didn't understand the words, and I didn't ask Dot. We had 10 camels. 4 carried water bags wrapped in cloth to slow the heat. 2 carried food and salt. 2 carried the boxes of tools. 1 carried Morel's chest and personal bag. 1 carried our tent and extra cloth. We had a small metal stove we never used after the first night because it wasn't worth the fuel. Morel's purpose was simple when he spoke to us and complicated when he spoke to Karim. He said there was a place in old trade records that didn't fit any known route. Traders spoke of a side path where they could rest among stone walls and find water without drawing from an open well. Some called it a city that died and was covered. Others called it a place of salt and bad air. Morel said he wanted proof that a town had existed deeper than the maps showed. He said there might be ancient writings that would be valuable to scholars. And to buyers. Delmas had agreed because Morel promised money for his clinic in Algiers. Renaud agreed because he was paid. Karim agreed because he wanted work and because he had relatives among the desert people. Alay agreed after a long discussion. I didn't understand, and after Morel promised gold and a rifle. I agreed because I wanted the work and because I didn't like leaving questions open when they were written in ink. On the second day, the ground changed from hard gravel to finer sand with scattered rock. The sun was sharp and the air was dry, enough to pull moisture from the mouth. We started before dawn, stopped at midday, and moved again when the light softened. At night, the cold came fast. The first time it happened, I lay awake and listened to the camels shifting in their ropes. Their breath sounded thick. The stars were bright enough to show the line of the dunes. The third day, we found a line of stones set in the sand. It ran straight for as far as we could see in either direction. Not a ridge of natural rock, but placed stones. Some were half buried, some were clean and exposed. Alay stopped the lead camel and looked along it without stepping closer. Karim asked him what it was. Alay answered with a short phrase. Karim turned to us. He says it is an old boundary line. He says caravans used to respect it. Between who? Morel asked. Karim asked again. Alay's eyes stayed on the stones. He says he doesn't know who made it, Karim said. He says if you follow it, you will find nothing good. Morel climbed off his saddle and walked to the stones. Renaud went with him, rifle in hand. I followed because it was my work to record. Delmas stayed back and watched our faces. The stones were worn but not rounded like river stones. They looked cut. I knelt and brushed sand away from one. It had a flat side with a groove. The groove was straight and clean. Morel said, "Mark it." I took out my pencil and sketched the shape. I measured the width of the groove with the edge of my measuring tool and wrote it down. The stone was warm even. Through my glove. Renaud said, "We are losing time." Morel ignored him. He leaned closer and ran his finger along the groove. He smiled once quick, like someone seeing familiar handwriting. Alay called out from the camels. His voice was sharp. Karim listened, then answered him, then came to us. He says we don't camp near this line, Karim said. He says we cross it and keep moving. Morel looked annoyed. Tell him we camp when I decide. Karim didn't translate that. He said something else to Alay, softer, and Alay's shoulders tightened. We crossed the line and continued. The stones fell behind us. The sky stayed clear. The wind stayed low, yet I felt a change in how people moved. Renaud checked the horizon more often. Oman stopped singing. Alay walked a little ahead of the lead camel instead of beside it, and he didn't look back to see if we followed. He assumed we would. That evening, we stopped earlier than planned because one water bag had a slow leak. It had rubbed against a box buckle. Delmas found it when he checked the straps. He patched it with resin and cloth, and we set the bag in a shallow pit to keep it cooler. Morel complained about the delay. Renaud watched him, then looked away. Karim sat with Alay a short distance from the rest of us. I heard their voices, but not the words. When the meal was done, I walked to them with my notebook. I didn't want to disturb, but I needed to know what Alay believed about the stone line. Karim looked up and spoke before I could. He doesn't like questions tonight. I only need the name of it, I said. Karim turned to Alay and asked. Alay didn't answer at first. He stared past us into the dark where the dunes had turned into a flat black mass. Finally, he spoke briefly. Karim hesitated, then said, "He says some people call it the line of the sealed ground. What does that mean?" I asked. Karim asked again. Alay answered with a longer string of words. then stopped and adjusted his veil as if he didn't want his mouth seen. Karim said. He says the ground beyond it was closed. People built a place there, then they closed it. Not with walls, with fear. I wrote the phrase as Karim said it. I didn't ask more because Karim's face had changed. He wasn't trying to scare me. He looked like someone repeating a warning he didn't own. I went back to the main camp. Morel was polishing his compass lens with a cloth. Delmas was writing notes by lantern. Renaud sat with his rifle across his knees, watching the camels. I lay down and tried to sleep. The sand under the blanket held the day's warmth for a while, then let it go. My mouth dried. I took one careful sip from my water bottle and closed it tight. Sometime after midnight, a camel made a low sound that woke me, then another. It wasn't panic. It was a complaint, like discomfort. I lifted my head and listened. The camels shifted their weight and pulled at the rope. Renaud stood up. I saw him by the starlight, a dark shape moving around the animals. He checked the knots, then walked out a short distance from camp, scanning the dunes. He didn't call out. He returned and sat again. In the morning, when the light was still weak, Alay pointed at the sand near the patched water bag. There were marks there. Not camel prints, not our boots. Small, deep holes in a line, like the track of a stick pressed into the sand at regular spaces. Renaud crouched and touched one with his finger. Wind, he said. Alay spoke to Karim. Karim listened and then said to us, he says it's not wind. He says something walked here at night, something that didn't sink like a man. Morel laughed once. It sounded forced. Tell him it's a fox, Karim translated. Alay shook his head and said a word that made Karim glance at me. What word? I asked. Karim answered quietly. He called it a watcher. He says we should move now. We moved before the sun cleared the low haze. Alay didn't let us stay near the marks. He pulled the lead rope himself and set a pace that made the camels breathe hard. Morel argued once, then stopped when he saw Alay wouldn't answer. Renaud stayed close to the rear camel and kept looking back as if he expected someone to follow our trail. The land flattened into a broad plain of pale sand mixed with small stones. The surface looked firm, but every few steps the hoof of a camel would punch through into softer powder. My boots filled with grit. The straps of my pack rubbed a raw line on my shoulder. I kept walking because stopping would only make the heat feel heavier. By mid-morning, we reached a low area where the sand had been swept away. A sheet of dark rock showed through, cracked into wide plates. In the gaps between plates, I saw thin lines that weren't natural cracks. They were too straight and too evenly spaced. Alay halted and stepped off the rock. He waved the camels around the edge as if it were a pit. Morel rode forward anyway and got off his camel on the rock. His face set with the look he used when he wanted to remind us he was in charge. It's stone, he said. It's not a curse. Delmas joined him and squatted to look at the lines. I followed with my notebook and took out my folding ruler. The lines formed a pattern like paving. Some plates had shallow cuts running across them. Others had shapes carved into the surface, worn but still visible. They weren't letters I recognized. They looked like a system of marks meant to be read by someone who knew them, not decoration. Morel's voice softened. This is it. Renaud came up behind us. How far? He asked. Morel didn't answer. He traced one carved mark with the tip of his finger, then pulled his hand back fast as if the rock had burned him. He stared at his fingertip, then at the mark again. Delmas noticed. Are you hurt? Morel shook his head. No, it's nothing. Delmas took Morel's hand anyway and examined the finger. No cut, he said. He looked at the rock. It's only warm. Alay spoke from the sand, his voice sharp. Karim answered him, then turned to us with a tired face. He says the stone is part of a road, Karim said. He says the road goes to the sealed place. He says we shouldn't step on it. Morel lifted his chin. Tell him the road is why we came. Kareem translated without adding softness. Alay's eyes narrowed. He said something that made Kareem hesitate. What? Morel demanded. Kareem answered. He says the watchers follow the road. Renaud snorted and looked away, but he didn't step onto the rock. He stayed on sand, boots planted apart. I wanted to argue with my own nerves, so I focused on work. I measured one of the cuts and noted its width. I sketched 3 of the marks in my notebook. While I drew, I felt an odd shaking through my knees, faint but steady. It stopped when I shifted my weight. I stood up and waited, holding still. The shaking returned, a light trembling that rose through the rock. It wasn't like distant thunder. It had no rhythm. It felt like something moving far beneath the stone. I didn't say it at first. I watched Delmas. His eyes were fixed on the rock, his mouth slightly open, as if he were listening with more than his ears. He looked at me. Do you feel it? I nodded once. Morel's face tightened. Feel what? Delmas tapped the stone with the back of his knuckles. The tapping sounded dull, a vibration. Morel stepped hard once, then again. I feel nothing. Renaud finally stepped onto the rock with one foot, then pulled it back. His jaw worked as if he were chewing something tough. I felt it, he said. Kareem stayed on the sand and watched us like we were careless children. Alay pointed along the edge of the rock plain. Ahead, the exposed stone continued in a line that vanished under sand again. It was a path, straight, too straight. Morel's excitement returned. We follow it, he said. Alay refused. He spoke to Kareem without looking at Morel. Kareem turned to Morel. He says he will take you near it, but not on it. He says if you ride the stone, you invite them. Morel opened his mouth to threaten. Delmas cut in first. We don't need to ride on it. We only need to reach the site. Morel looked as if he wanted to argue with Delmas, then he swallowed it. Fine, he said. We keep it in sight. Alay led us along the sand beside the rock road. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered above the stone. The shaking came and went beneath the surface, faint enough that I could doubt it when it stopped, clear enough that I couldn't deny it when it returned. In the afternoon, we found the first object that made Renaud stop without being told. A pole stood half buried in sand, angled as if it had been driven into the ground and later pushed by wind. It wasn't wood. It was metal, blackened and pitted, with a ring near the top. Morel hurried to it. A marker, he said. Alay spoke. Again, Kareem's voice dropped. He says, don't touch it. Morel touched it anyway. He gripped it with both hands and pulled. The pole didn't move. He then brushed sand away around its base, exposing a round plate with holes. It looked like a mount for something. Larger, now gone. Renaud raised his rifle a little. This isn't old, he said. I crouched and looked closely. The metal was worn, but the shape was exact. The ring at the top wasn't a crude loop. It was made clean. Delmas said, if caravans knew of a city, they didn't build this. Morel's eyes flicked to him. Then who did? No one answered. The wind was still low, yet sand slid around the pole in small streams, as if drawn by the slightest movement of air. I watched the sand and saw it slip into a narrow gap at the base plate, disappearing like water into a drain. I leaned closer. The gap was too even to be a crack. It was a seam. Alay made a short sound and turned away, tugging the lead rope. He wanted distance. Oman followed without question. Kareem lingered, looking at the pole with a tight look on his face. What is it called? I asked Kareem, keeping my voice low so Morel wouldn't hear. Kareem hesitated. He has a name for places like this. He says it's a mouth. A mouth for what? Kareem didn't answer. He looked toward Alay and then back to me. He says the sealed place takes what it wants. We moved on. The pole stayed behind us, a slanted black line against the sand, toward evening. The sky shifted from hard blue to a washed, dusty color. The light turned flat. My eyes stung. The horizon lost contrast. Ale slowed and raised his hand. He listened. I heard nothing at first, then a faint sound like grains of sand striking cloth. A wind, Renaud said. Ale shook his head. He spoke quickly. Karim translated in a clipped tone. He says the sand is moving without wind. He says it happens near the sealed ground. Morel glanced at the rock road, which now ran closer to us, its edge appearing again in long straight stretches. We're close, he said, as if that was comfort. The sound grew louder. It came in short bursts, then stopped, then returned. It didn't match the air. My scarf lay still against my neck. Yet the sound of sand on cloth came again, as if someone were throwing handfuls at our packs. Renaud walked to the rear and checked the camels. No one is throwing anything, he said, then fell silent when another burst rattled against the box lids. Delmas spoke quietly, almost to himself. Static movement, he said, then caught my look and shook his head as if he didn't want to explain a theory he didn't trust. We made camp early because Ale insisted. He chose a low dip between two ridges, not deep enough to trap us, but enough to break line of sight from the road. He pushed the camels close together and tied them in a tight ring. He then took a bundle from his saddle and placed small stones at measured distances around the camp, forming a rough circle. Morel watched this with irritation. What is he doing? Karim answered. He's marking the boundary. Tell him we don't need it. Karim didn't translate. He simply looked at Morel and said, he will do it anyway. That night, after we ate, Morel unlocked his metal chest and removed a rolled paper map and a small notebook. He spread them on a blanket and called me over. Delmas came too. Renaud stayed near the camels, but he watched us from the side. Morel pointed to a mark on the map, a blank area with a pencil dot. Here, he said. Hold notes from a caravan master. He wrote of walls that don't crumble and a water source that doesn't taste of salt. He wrote of people who didn't trade, only watched. He wrote they had lamps that didn't burn oil. Delmas said, caravan stories grow. Morel's eyes flashed, not always. Some grow, some are warnings. Karim listened from a few steps away. His face was unreadable. I asked, why did the caravan master leave? Morel tapped the map with a finger. He wrote one sentence that mattered. He wrote that the city wasn't empty, but it wasn't alive in the way men are alive. Renaud spoke from the camels. We should turn back. Morel looked up fast. You're paid to protect, not advise. Renaud's voice stayed level. I'm paid to keep us alive. This isn't a fort. We're far from help. We already lost water. Now the sand moves without wind. The guide fears what we can't see. If we find ruins, fine. If we find people, we trade and leave. If we find something else, your chest of papers won't matter. Morel's face hardened. He shut the notebook and locked the chest with a sharp click. We go one more day, he said. If there's nothing, we leave. If there's something, we decide then. No one argued because the argument wouldn't change his mind. I lay down later and listened to the camels again. The night was colder than before. The stars were bright, but the air felt heavy in my lungs, as if the dryness had turned to powder. I slept in short pieces. Each time I woke, I heard the same soft sound at the edge of camp. Sand sliding, not a gust, not a creature running. A steady, patient movement, circling. Near dawn, a camel cried out sharp and loud. I sat up at once. Renaud was already on his feet, rifle raised. Ale stood inside his stone circle, eyes fixed on a point beyond it. I followed his gaze and saw a shape in the gray light. It stood just outside the ring of stones, still as a post. It was tall, narrow, and covered in cloth that hung straight down. No face showed, no hands showed. It didn't move when Renault aimed at it. It didn't flinch when the camel cried again. Kareem whispered behind me, voice tight, "Don't speak." The shape turned its head a small amount, not toward Renault, not toward Alay, but toward the rock road hidden beyond the ridge, as if it were listening to something only it could hear. Then it stepped back once, and the sand around its feet sank without a footprint, as if the ground had opened and closed. The shape was gone, and the spot where it had stood was flat. Renault fired anyway. The shot cracked the morning and made the camels jerk. The bullet struck sand. Nothing answered. Morel stumbled out of the tent, hair messy, eyes wide. What was that? No one spoke for a moment. Alay picked up one of the stones from the circle and held it in his palm. It was wet on the underside, dark with moisture, though the sand around it was dry. He showed it to Kareem. Kareem's throat moved as he swallowed. He turned to us. "He says we are seen," Kareem said. "He says today. We reach the place or we die on the road." I tightened my grip on my notebook, not because it would help, but because it was the only thing that felt solid. We broke camp fast. The sun rose behind us as we climbed out of the dip. Ahead, the rock road appeared again, a dark line cutting the sand straight toward the empty horizon. We followed the road at a distance, close enough to see it clearly, far enough that Alay wouldn't refuse to walk. The land rose slowly, not in dunes, but in long shelves of stone covered by thin sand. The camels struggled more here. Their hooves slipped on exposed rock, and Oman coughed harder each time he urged them forward. The sound beneath the ground returned, stronger than before. It was no longer something I could doubt. It passed through the soles of my boots in short pulses, like pressure changes rather than movement. Each pulse made the camels jerk their heads and snort. Delmas stopped once and placed his palm flat on the sand. He closed his eyes, then pulled his hand away and wiped it on his coat as if the contact bothered him. "This isn't natural," he said quietly. Morel snapped. "Everything is natural. We simply don't understand it yet." Delmas didn't respond. He walked closer to Kareem instead and asked him something in French meant only for him. Kareem answered in the same low tone. I caught only fragments, words about old stories, about places where ground was closed by command. Renault moved to the front and walked beside Alay now, not behind. He didn't speak to him, but his posture had changed. He held his rifle ready, finger near the trigger, eyes forward. Near midday, we reached a shallow bowl where the sand had collapsed inward. The ground formed a wide dip, its edges smooth as if scooped out. At the center stood stone buildings, partly buried but clear. Walls. They weren't tall. Most rose no higher than a man's chest. They formed rectangles and long hallways that ran at right angles. The stone was pale and dense, fitted so tightly that no glue showed. The surfaces were worn but clean, as if sand had polished them over centuries. Morel let out a breath that sounded like relief. "There," he said. "You see?" Alay stopped at the rim of the bowl. He didn't go down. He spoke to Kareem with urgency. Kareem turned to us. "He says this is the outer edge. He says the city is below. He says the watchers don't like the outer edge being crossed." Morel was already climbing down, sliding on the sand with careless steps. Renault followed him immediately, cursing under his breath. I went next, more carefully, testing each step. Delmas came behind me. Kareem hesitated, then followed. Alay and Oman stayed above with the camels. The air felt different inside the bowl. It was cooler, but not by much. It felt contained. Sounds didn't travel far. When Renault kicked a loose stone, the sound died quickly, as if absorbed. I approached the nearest wall and ran my hand over it. The stone was smooth and cold. I found carvings again, deeper and clearer than those on the road. Lines, angles, repeating symbols. Not decorative, functional. "These are markers," I said without thinking. "Morel." came to my side. Of what? I pointed along the wall. Paths, boundaries, instructions. Delmas looked at the ground. There's no broken pieces, he said. No broken pottery, no trash. A town leaves waste. This place is clean. Renaud scanned. The hallways between the walls. Too clean. We moved deeper. The layout became clearer. Rows of low rooms opened onto narrow passages. Some passages ended in steps that went further underground. Others ended at sealed stone slabs set into the ground. Each slab marked with the same symbol. Karim stopped near one and stared at it. His face pale. I've seen this mark, he said. Not here. In stories. What does it mean? I asked. He shook his head. It means don't open. Morel knelt anyway and looked at the slab. He traced the symbol, then smiled with a tight satisfaction. This is a closure, he said. A controlled closure. A system. Renaud grabbed his shoulder. Get up. Morel pulled away. Don't touch me. Renaud lowered his voice. Listen to the ground. We all did. The pulsing shaking had grown stronger. It came in waves now, slow and steady. Each wave made a fine dust rise from the cracks between stones. Delmas said, something is active. Morel stood, eyes bright. Yes, maintenance or defense. Alay's voice echoed faintly from above. He was shouting to Karim, calling him back. Karim looked torn. He took a step toward the bowl edge, then stopped when Morel spoke again. We're here, Morel said. You wanted to translate. Translate this. He pointed to a larger building at the center of the bowl. Unlike the others, it rose higher, a low tower with a flat top. A ramp spiraled around it, half buried but whole. Renaud swore under his breath. That's not a home. We approached the tower. With each step, the shaking increased. My teeth rattled lightly. My stomach tightened, not from fear alone, but from pressure, like going down too fast. At the base of the tower stood an opening tall enough for a man to enter without bending. It wasn't dark inside. A dull, steady light came from within, white and even, without flicker. Morel stopped breathing for a moment. Then he laughed, short and sharp. You see? Lamps that don't burn oil. Delmas grabbed his arm. This is beyond us. Morel shook him off. This is exactly us. Karim whispered. We should leave now. Renaud raised his rifle and aimed into the opening. If something comes out, I'll fire. Nothing came out. The light remained steady. The shaking slowed, then paused as if waiting. I felt watched again, stronger than before. Not from a single point, but from the walls, the ground, the air. I turned in a slow circle and saw movement at the edges of the bowl. Shapes stood along the rim, tall and still, spaced evenly. I counted 6 before I forced myself to stop. Karim saw them too. His hands trembled. They're here. Alay's voice broke from above, shouting in anger and fear. Oman's cough turned into a panicked gasp. Morel stepped toward the opening. Renaud blocked him. If you cross that line, I'll drag you back. Morel's face twisted. You're afraid. Yes, Renaud said. And so should you be. The light inside the tower brightened slightly. The shaking returned faster now. The stone under my feet warmed. Delmas spoke with urgency. This place isn't empty. It's controlled. We're intruders. One of the shapes at the rim moved. It stepped forward without sound, going down the slope. The sand didn't shift under it. It stopped at the edge of the bowl, facing the tower. Another shape followed. Karim dropped to his knees. He spoke rapidly in a language I didn't understand, his voice cracking. The shapes didn't react. Morel's breathing grew fast. They're guarding it, he said. They've always guarded it. Renaud lowered his rifle slightly, then raised it again when the first shape went further down the slope, now halfway down. Alay shouted again, a command this time. I saw him pulling at the camel's ropes, trying to turn them. The shape reached the bowl floor. It stood still, closer now. The cloth covering it hung straight, unmoved by air. Where a face should be, there was only darkness. The shaking stopped. The light inside the tower dimmed, then flared bright enough to hurt my eyes. The sound from inside the tower turned into steps, not echoes. Weight shifting onto stone, measured and slow. Each step matched a pulse in the ground, as if the building itself were coordinating the movement. Renault fired. The shot struck the edge of the opening and chipped stone. The sound was swallowed quickly. Nothing rushed out. Nothing reacted. Morel shouted at him, "You fool!" Delmas grabbed Renault's arm. "Stop!" The shape at the bowl floor turned its head toward Renault. It didn't move otherwise. The second shape stopped on the slope, watching. From the tower opening came a figure unlike the watchers. It was broader, its body divided with hard plates that reflected the light in flat tones. No cloth covered it. Its limbs were jointed in a way that didn't match human movement. It didn't walk forward at once. It stood at the doorway as if checking. The light behind it dimmed again, settling into a steady glow. Karim pressed his forehead to the ground. He was still speaking, but his words had become a whisper. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, not pain but force. A sense of direction without sound. I knew where it wanted us to look. Toward the road, toward the route we had taken to enter. Staggered slightly and caught himself on my arm. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Renault shifted his stance. "It's trying to move us." The plated figure took one step forward. The ground hardened under its foot, the sand flattening. As if pressed. It raised one arm. The arm ended not in a hand, but in a bunch of hard segments that adjusted their shape. Morel stepped around Renault before anyone could stop him. "We come to write things down," he said loudly, his voice shaking. "We're scholars. We mean no harm." The figure didn't respond. The watchers remained still. Then the ground between us and the tower changed. The sand sank away, showing a smooth stone surface rising from beneath. It formed a barrier waist high, straight and clean. "We're being contained," Delmas said. Renault cursed and fired again. This time at the barrier, the bullet flattened and dropped. No crack, no damage. The plated figure stepped forward again, now fully outside the tower. The shaking returned, steady and strong. My knees weakened. I dropped to one knee without choosing. To Karim cried out, "They're closing the path." I turned and saw the road behind us. Where it had been a clear line of stone, sections were sinking, sliding beneath the sand as if pulled down from below. The straight road we had followed was being erased. Morel's face went pale. "They're sealing it again." Alay's shout carried down from above, desperate now. I heard camels screaming, the raw sound of panic. Then the sound cut off suddenly. Renault spun toward the slope. "They're taking the camels." The watcher nearest the rim moved again, this time faster. It reached the edge and raised an arm. Identical to the plated figures, the sand at the rim hardened into a smooth wall, cutting off our exit. We were trapped inside the bowl. Delmas backed toward the barrier that had risen between us and the tower. "This is a system," he said. "Not a trap in the human sense, a response." "To what?" I asked. "To presence," he said. "To disruption." The plated figure turned its head toward Morel. The pressure behind my eyes got stronger. Images rose without my choosing. Not memories, not visions, but information. Patterns, movement. A sense of purpose that wasn't hostile, but absolute. Karim screamed and collapsed onto his side. Blood ran from his nose. Delmas rushed to him, shouting his name. Morel staggered and grabbed his chest. "I understand," he gasped. "They weren't hiding. They were maintaining." The plated figure raised its segmented arm again. The barrier behind us lowered slightly. Not enough to pass, but enough to change the space. The watchers shifted positions, forming a ring. Renault made a decision. He ran at the barrier near the slope and threw himself against it. His shoulders struck stone. He fell back hard, breath knocked from him. "They won't let us leave," he said hoarsely. The plated figure moved closer. It stopped a few steps from Morel. The pressure peaked, then shifted. Words formed in my mind. Not sounds, but clear instruction. "Leave now. Do not return." Morel laughed weakly. "We can't." The instruction came again, stronger, paired with a feeling of closing, of narrowing options. Delmas looked up from Karim. "It's not threatening," he said. "It's final." Karim's eyes opened. He whispered, "They let some go." The plated figure turned slightly toward Karim. The pressure eased for a moment. The barrier near the slope lowered further, forming a narrow opening. Renault didn't hesitate. He grabbed Karim under the arms and dragged him toward it. "Move," he shouted. Delmas followed, half carrying Karim. I ran after them. The opening was just wide enough for one person at a time. As I reached it, I felt the stone brush my shoulders, cold and smooth. Morel remained behind. He was kneeling now, his notebook open on the ground. He was writing, hands shaking but exact. "Come," Delmas shouted. Morel looked up once. His face was calm. "Someone must stay," he said. "To be counted." The plated figure stood beside him. "UNMOV, I need." Renault turned back, rage on his face. "You'll die," Morel nodded. "This place isn't death," he said. "It's order." The pressure surged again, forcing my gaze away. The opening began to close. Renault dragged me through. The stone sealed behind us with no sound. We were on the slope now, scrambling upward through loose sand. Above, Ale was running, pulling Oman with him. The camels were gone. The watcher shape stood along the rim, still and silent. The bowl behind. US changed. The walls sank. The tower lowered. Stone disappeared beneath sand as if drawn downward. Within minutes, the place was a shallow dip again, empty and clean. The shaking faded. The pressure lifted. We didn't stop running until the road was gone and the sun was low. We walked until our legs shook and our mouths burned. Ale didn't stop until the light thinned and the ground rose into broken stone that slowed us, whether we wished it or not. Only then did he halt and turn, scanning the horizon behind us. There was nothing to see. No bowl, no road. Only sand and rock, undisturbed. Renault lowered Karim gently to the ground. Karim's breathing was shallow, his skin damp and cold. Delmas knelt at once and opened his bag, working without speaking. He wiped blood from Karim's nose and checked his pupils, then pressed his fingers to Karim's neck and wrist. "He's alive," Delmas said, "but he's injured in a way I don't fully understand." Karim's eyes fluttered open. He looked at each of us in turn, then past us, searching for something that was no longer there. "They marked him," he whispered. "Who?" Renault asked. Karim swallowed. "The one who stayed." Delmas stiffened. "Morel," Karim nodded faintly. "He chose to be counted. They accept those who don't resist." Renault turned away and kicked at the ground hard enough to hurt himself. He didn't cry out. Ale crouched a short distance away, drawing lines in the sand with a stone. He spoke quietly to Oman, who sat with his head down, coughing into his sleeve. Their camels were gone. All of our extra water was gone with them. Ale finally looked at us. He spoke to Karim slowly, carefully. Karim translated, his voice weak. "He says the sealed place doesn't kill without reason. It keeps, it watches. When too many come, it closes. When one stays, it balances." "That's nonsense," Renault said, though his voice lacked force. Ale answered before Karim could. His tone was sharp. Karim translated again. "He says, the desert remembers paths. It also remembers boundaries. We crossed one that wasn't meant to open. Night fell hard. We had no tent, The cold came fast. We huddled close, sharing what little water remained. No one spoke for a long time. I kept seeing Morel kneeling by the tower, calm and focused, as if he had finally found a place that fit him. The memory didn't fade when I tried to push it away. Before dawn, Kareem woke screaming. Delmas held him until the shaking stopped. Kareem couldn't explain what he had seen. He only said the word count again and again until his voice failed. At first light, Allah told us the route we would take. It wasn't the way we had come. He refused to cross the old road's line. Again, he would take us wide, even if it cost days. Renaud didn't argue. Neither did I. The march back was harder than the way in. The land fought us. Sand shifted underfoot. Heat rose earlier each day. Oman's cough got worse. On the second day, he collapsed and couldn't stand again. Alain knelt beside him and spoke quietly. Oman shook his head and pressed something into Alain's hand, a small carved token I had never seen before. Alain closed Oman's fingers around his own blade fur. A moment, then stood. "We can't carry him," Renaud said, voice flat. Delmas didn't look up. "I know. Oman died before noon." We covered him with stones and moved on. No marker, no prayer spoken aloud. On the fourth day, we reached a place where the sand gave way to gravel and scrub. On the fifth, we found the track of a caravan. On the sixth, we saw smoke on the horizon. When we reached the town, the people listened without interrupting. When Alay spoke of the sealed place, the elders nodded and told us we were lucky to have lost only what we did. No one asked about Morel. Delmas treated Kareem for weeks after. Kareem never fully got better. He lost words sometimes, stopping mid-sentence, as if listening to something far away. He refused to travel south again. Renaud returned to his army group. I heard later that he requested transfer to a coast post and never took another desert assignment. As for me, I wrote my report with care. I recorded the road, the stone, the symbols. I didn't record the tower. I didn't record the watchers. I didn't record Morel's choice. The official response dismissed the trip as misled by local superstition and stress from the environment. My sketches were filed away and forgotten. Years later, I met a trader who spoke of a straight line of stone that appeared after storms and vanished again. He said some guides refused to cross it, even when paid well. I didn't correct him.